So this week we're looking at campaigns, and when we talk about campaigns and putting a person in front of a large audience, you often come face with the dilemma of whether or not to emphasize your race, ethnicity, and gender, or to minimize it. And so this lecture focuses on non-racialized campaigns. The concept of deracialization in American politics isn't new. Race and ethnic candidates have had to make strategic political calculations about how to market themselves during an election. So anytime you see an election or an upcoming election, ask yourself, are they emphasizing their race, ethnicity, their sex, and their gender, or are they de-emphasizing it? Deracialized strategy. Minority candidates deployed a narrative that downplays the significance of race. The term deracialization as a general theory incorporates related ideas such as the post-blackness, post-racialism, and color blindness, all of which speak to characteristics of American culture in general that have been applied to circumstances of Black electoral politics in particular. We can't really study it on Asian Americans, Native Americans, or Latinos because we haven't really had any major electoral candidates that have those specific ethnic or racial categories. Each of these theorists assert in their own unique way that race and racial identity is and can or should be sublimated, disregarded, redefined, or reappropriated in response to real or imagined individual level racial prejudice and or systemic racism. Charles Hamilton popularized the idea of deracialization, dictating how Black candidates must negotiate race to attract white voters, increase the numerical representation in government, and thereby gain a greater share of political power. There are three pillars that form deracialization's foundation. The first pillar emphasizes the Black candidate's ability to represent the interest of all citizens despite the racial differences between the candidate and the targeted white voters. Keep in mind that any minority that runs for any elected office cannot win without white voter support. Here's an example. A candidate has white constituents in an ad, highlighting their shared values, and then the minority candidate appears reminding the voter at the end of the advertisement that he or she shares those values. The second pillar is a Black candidate's emphasis on character traits consistent with mainstream American values, constructed as American values are white values. The Black candidates seem to align him or herself with these national values despite the fact that the color of a candidate's skin belies the idea, right? So the person that we're sort of focusing in on here is Barack Obama, since he's the only Black or African American doing the highest level of office, okay? The repetitive phrases and common themes like hardworking, playing by the rules, personal responsibility are indicative of most Black candidates who have used such language to emphasize character traits and accomplishments that are not only consistent with mainstream values, but those that disassociate themselves from long-standing Black stereotypes. The third and final pillar compromises deracialization's foundation by encompassing both the first and the second pillar and advance the fundamental electoral message, vote for me despite the fact that I'm Black. Deracialization relies on Black candidates' ability to persuade white voters to either disregard race altogether or at least minimize the degree to which race influences their voting decision. Both deracialization and implicit communication theory share the underlying assumption that whites primarily racialize. White racial prejudices color political decisions affecting Black candidates or Black political interests. So whether we like it or not, we look at candidates through the spectrum of color, right? And so if you are a minority candidate running in any kind of race, you have to minimize your race or ethnicity and highlight the fact that your values are the shared values of the majority of the community. It happens in every election. White racial prejudices color political decisions affecting Black candidates or Black political interest. White candidates deploy race-based appeals to activate those prejudices, and Black candidates must sublimate race to ameliorate the effects of both white racial prejudice and the kinds of communicative appeals that activate them. In the broadest possible sense, deracialization and implicit communication theory also share the belief that racialization is fundamentally negative. They both assume that the only possibility for successfully mobilizing race is to use it to activate white negative racial predispositions, which ultimately work against the interests of Black candidates. So, for example, you could show a commercial or a TV ad that highlights a minority engaging in a criminal activity or being released from prison, right? These have been successful advertisements that have been used in the past in various campaigns. The American inclusion of race-neutral voting. There has been a disconnect when it comes to American national ideas about racial equity and voting patterns with respect to Black political candidates. In a social and political climate where people believe the twin principles of racial inequality and race-neutral voting, they are unlikely to realize and/or admit that race affects their political decisions. On the one hand, considering race might unduly influence their vote, likely to the Black candidate's disadvantage. On the other hand, taking race into account may offer the Black candidate an unfair advantage. This is an essence of colorblind ideology, believing that race should play no role in political decision-making, ensuring equality in the sense that no one will be either unfairly disadvantaged or receive so-called preferential treatment. The climate of racial awareness. The nation's heightened sense of racial awareness is the second condition that made it strategically possible for Obama to execute a racial distinct strategy. Race permeated the 2008 presidential election, arguably more than any other presidential election in contemporary America. Three factors instigated and sustained this heightened sense of racial awareness. First, Obama was primarily regarded and identified as African American, thus framing his candidacy as historic. Second, Obama was a frontrunner throughout most of the campaign and therefore a prominent source of increased media attention. And finally, these factors contribute to the continuous media coverage that consistently highlighted Obama's race. The racial distinction, the narrative strategy. The racial distinction strategy refers to the deliberate choice to distinguish Obama according to race, while the racial distinction narrative refers to the actual racialized message that the campaign produced and that Obama communicated to voters throughout the campaign. Obama's racial distinction narrative was successfully largely because he incorporated simultaneous emphasis on his own racial identity and appeals to national unity within a larger narrative of American progress. Look how great America is because I've come so far, is what he was saying. It derives its success from its ability to persuade Americans that voting on the basis of race has both practical and symbolic meaning, significance, and legitimacy, while at the same time allowing Americans to maintain belief in race-neutral voting. Rather than convince white voters that to disregard race when weighing their vote, Obama's racial distinction strategy asked voters to vote for him because of his race. The takeaways. Obama's elections highlights the fact that racial distinction or deracialization can work. Using skin color and personal story within a broader story of the nation together formed a narrative of America's racial progress. His use of personal narratives as Americans to make race a factor in their voting decision, because it would be historically meaningful and legitimate within the context of America, whose history up to 2008 demonstrated that it had not taken its most significant step to prove that it could, and indeed had lived up to its founding ideals. Do you think minority candidates should deracialize as they campaign? Do you think you will see another minority elected president? Would it make you think differently of them? right? These are things to think about when you see minority candidates running for office.